New Orleans, the French Quarter, the year 1932. Nighttime. You find yourself strolling down a cobblestone street. Gloomy fog swirls with a sepia glow under the old lamps. The clip-clop of hooves grows louder. An old-fashioned carriage? When it passes, the clip-clopping fades in an eerie silence, an unusual silence. No automobile rumbles through, no ship horn sounds, no jazz notes drifting in from some smoky little dive. For some unknown reason, you shudder. Then faint sobbing draws your attention. A small girl tears through the fog in your direction, tears streaming down her face, an expression of utter horror and sheer terror. You stop to help. A crowd gathers. Taverns spill their patrons, homes empty their residents. Everyone is drawn to the suffering wails. Finally, a police officer. The girl sprints into his arms, tells him through a shroud of tears that two brothers had kidnapped and tortured her. She pleads with the officer to go back to a house where there are more victims. Many more victims. Then she collapses. Volunteers carry her to the hospital. Rumors swirl throughout the city like an ocean blow. Kidnap victims? Torture? What brothers did the girl refer to? Hours later, the girl dies at the hospital. Anger sweeps through the still gathering crowd. Before succumbing, the girl names her torturers. Two brothers that worked at the docks, John and Wayne Carter. The crowd turns into a seething mob. The whole quarter knows who the brothers are. They can't stop the mob. The police try to harness it, control it. At the head of the mob, they set out to arrest the Carters. Arriving at the home, they are met by a foul odor. Rustling comes from inside the house. It's not empty. The police pound thunderously on the door. No response. The impatient mob overpowers the police and smashes through the door, revealing the two brothers scurrying inside. They are covered in blood. The police race to arrest the Carters before the vigilant crowd can seize them. One of the powerful brothers picks up a police officer by the throat and throws him like a rag doll across the room. The frightened crowd stills. The officers charge the Carters. One by one, the brothers with monstrous strength throw them off. The mob finds its courage and joins the fray. Finally, the killers are overpowered and cuffed. Interrogating them on the scene, the cops demand to know if there are any more victims alive. They are met with silence. But the foul odor draws police attention upstairs. They find their way up to the attic. The stench grows overpowering. They push on, force open the door. A scene too horrible to become even a nightmare. Dark red blood covers the walls and floor. Prisoners are chained together like emaciated dolls. Men, women, and children. Gaunt faces barely able to look up at their liberators in the moonlit shadows. But for the survivors, the worst is over. Or is it? New Orleans, the Crescent City, the Big Easy, the city that Care forgot, famous for Cajun cuisine and Mardi Gras. culture and debauchery, jazz clubs and marching band funerals. The weeks following the horrific discovery in the Carters' home were a circus in the city. Raging crowds gathered at the jail and then at the courtroom. The Carters were found guilty, of course, and sentenced to execution. The city rejoiced. This was not a time in our history where those convicted of murder lingered on death row for years. John and Wayne Carter were quickly executed and buried above the swampy ground in the type of mausoleum New Orleans is known for. Soon the city all but forgot the murderous monsters, but not for long. A year after their interment, a grave robber broke into their mausoleum. What they found astonished. The coffin lids had already been removed from the inside. Both corpses were missing. But who can a grave robber report such a thing to? So he just went to a tavern, of course. Liquid courage. And his story poured out almost as fast as the drinks poured in. Citizens rushed to the mausoleum and found it just as described. Word spread through the stunned city. Authorities gathered at the cemetery. Not a clue found. Then another wild rumor swept the city. The brothers, the deceased brothers, had been seen on the balcony of their old home. Remember, this was long before the birth of Anne Rice and her famous New Orleans vampires. At first, speculation was that the brothers had become vengeful ghosts. But then citizens recalled the drained blood of the living victims in that attic. And there's nothing ethereal about the brothers seen on the balcony. Plus, a ghost doesn't need a body. And the corpses of the Carters were missing. Slowly, settling in like the fog at dusk, citizens came to the most likely conclusion. Vampires. This seemed confirmed when one of the survivors began developing odd traits of his own. The man, Philippe, began having wild fantasies about blood and gore. He suffered feverish dreams and described an insatiable thirst. Survivors had described how the Carters had tied them down, slashed their skin, and proceeded to lap at their wounds like hounds. Strangely, all of these survivors eventually met a tragic end of one type or another. But nothing compared to the fate of Philippe. He had lived a normal life before his abduction. But afterwards, tortured by his feverish dreams and insatiable urges, he became what we now call a serial killer. He murdered over 30 people. With each victim, he attempted to drink their blood while they were still alive. He left behind a manifesto inside a diary found on Bourbon Street, then just disappeared. His manifesto is either some code or just gibberish, indecipherable. Another survivor of the Carter butchery also became a killer, though it's not known if he drank blood. Yet another poor crazed survivor of the Carters killed and boiled his victims in acid. Finally, one Carter victim, a young woman, resisted the strange and unshakable urge by checking herself into an asylum. She reported the desire to kill and feed never left her mind. To this day, there have been sightings of the Carter brothers, still flesh and blood, having aged none since their supposed execution. Yellowtail writer and researcher Katherine McGowan, who brought us this episode, is whether the myth of vampirism somehow so damaged the survivors that the idea infected their minds. Which makes sense. If you manage to survive such a traumatizing experience, and then pick up on the vampire rumors running rampant, it seems possible, even likely, that you might undergo some kind of psychosis where you believe you've been infected with the same disease, that you were becoming a vampire. But why did vampire legends about the Carters take such a firm grip on the local population? Was it merely the bizarre circumstances of their imprisoned victims? Or the strange disappearance of their corpses? As it turned out, this was not the first dance with an alleged vampire in the city known for its voodoo curses. New Orleans culture is rooted in vagabonds and pirates that settled the French territory. But the pirate town that guarded the entrance to the Mississippi more than 2 centuries ago had a big problem. Not enough women. Well, not marriageable women anyway. There were plenty of prostitutes, of course, but men trying to create a reputation did not want to settle down with these types of women. There was a large Catholic convent filled with nuns, but they had declared their life for God. So the men begged the King of France to send marriageable women. The king, wishing to comply, so he offered poor women in France free passage, because peasant life in France could be brutal, so there was no shortage of women who jumped at the chance. But a particular group of them turned out to be, well, a little odd. On the long perilous ocean passage to the New World, they each took along something very strange. A coffin. One for every girl. Intrigued? So were many at the time. The women came to be called casket girls. Perhaps they brought a coffin in case they died at sea and didn't want to be devoured by the creatures of the sea. When they arrived in New Orleans, in order to protect their reputation, they lodged in the convent with the nuns. Of course, they still had their coffins with them. Men eager to meet the women gathered outside the convent. But rumors about the casket girls spread. For example, one claimed that girls carried local soil in their coffins. The nuns tried to reassure locals that the girls only used the coffins to carry their possessions. Whispers of suspicion grew more fervent when the top floor of the convent was suddenly sealed shut. It was said the priest had been forced to seal the shutters with blessed nails sprinkled with holy water. It was alleged that the caskets were held within these sealed rooms. So the population of ruffians, brigands, and hard-scrapple pioneers, eager for wives, grew uneasy. Things got worse when yellow fever spread through the city, filling up the city's cemeteries. Fingers pointed at the mysterious casket girl sealed away in the floor of the convent. As the years went by, dark rooms or not, one by one the girls found a husband. After all, lonely men are lonely men. The rumors about the casket girls waned but never died, swirling just below the surface, until wild sightings and accusations again inflamed the city. This time it was claimed that some of the casket girls had been seen flying off the roof of the convent. If that didn't satisfy your thirst for real New Orleans vampires, we have good news for you. Yet one more tantalizing story from the city's history. The legendary, mythical, and seemingly immortal Saint Germain himself once traveled to the Big Easy. Have you heard of this infamous man? Count Jacques Saint Germain. He went by many names and titles in the 1700s, as was common for European nobility. Where he was from and who he really was remains a mystery, as well as just how long he managed to live. Saint Germain became prominent in European high society starting in the 1740s. He spoke multiple languages, was a brilliant philosopher, a notable musician, and an alchemist, and even a diplomat who ran missions for the King of France. The English at one point arrested him on suspicion of espionage. With black hair and pale skin, he was described by the famous Casanova as a handsome ladies' man. He was welcome at European courts and aristocratic homes for his unrivaled conversation. He claimed to be 100 years old, but his origins remained a mystery. To a German prince that he became very close to, he eventually confessed his true beginnings. He was the son of a Transylvanian prince who had been forced to flee during a power struggle. Ah, that Transylvania. An avid adventurer, Saint Germain eventually made it to the New World, arriving in New Orleans in the 1800s. He became famous for lavish balls, and he continued his life of hard drinking and womanizing well until the early hours of the morning. Saint Germain had first shown up in European circles in the 1840s, and at that time he appeared to be a man of around 40 years. In New Orleans, almost a century later, he appeared no older or worse for the wear. Why choose New Orleans over New York, Boston, or Philadelphia? In most American cities, his lewd behavior would be scandalous, but in New Orleans, it made him a hero. When local harlots started disappearing, no one suspected any connection at all to the fine nobleman. Not until one evening when a local prostitute ran screaming from Saint Germain's balcony and flung herself to the cobblestone streets. Now people started asking questions. Saint Germain now disappeared from the city before he could be questioned, quickly escaping with his wealth and possessions. No one saw him leave. Witnesses claimed Saint Germain had been inside his residence when the girl had flung herself off the balcony. Does her death remind you of the fleeing girl we opened this video with? Police searched the home of Saint Germain. Inside the wine cellar, in addition to expensive bottles of wine, they found something more disturbing. First, it was struck by the strange coppery odor permeating the cellar. Poking around, they decided to take a close look at these wine bottles. And inside many of them was not wine. You can certainly guess what they found. Authorities put out a wanted notice on Saint Germain. Whose blood was inside those bottles? Were the victims dead or alive? No sign of Saint Germain was ever found. Presumably he sailed back to Europe. But some of the bottles were preserved. In the 1990s, the residue inside was actually tested, confirming that the dark substance had indeed been blood. In fact, the blood of multiple people. At one time, the wine cellar had been filled with such bottles. Just how many victims did this represent? There is a saying in New Orleans that once you drink from the water of the city, you will be compelled to return again and again. An irresistible urge, a terrible need, a marker in your soul that drives you to come back to the Big Easy, even if you're no longer among the living. From time to time, the casket girls are seen around the old convent. The Carter brothers are encountered walking the old cemetery or looking down from their former balcony. And Saint Germain himself, now using the name Jack, might bum a smoke, share a drink in some dark bar, or entice a beautiful woman to dance with him. If you visit the city, you may find yourself walking a foggy cobblestone street under a silvery moon. If it's quiet enough, You might hear the ghostly sobs of a young girl. Your blood may run cold at the sound, but be glad it still runs at all.